At Rico, we make TMI work for the insurance industry. From automated customer onboarding to accurate invoice processing to your claim was approved, there's no such thing as too much information. Our experts unlock the power of your trapped information so you can spend more time focused on what matters most. Your customers. We love TMI. Rico. Imagine change.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to the 18th century, and we're going to be looking at the life of Daniel Boone. And to help us with Daniel Boone, we've got a gentleman here, Mr. Rodney Smith. He's currently the principal of the Bladen Early College High School at Bladen Community College here in southeastern North Carolina. Mr. Smith holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Campbell University, a Master of Science degree in Counseling from North Carolina A&T University, and a Master of Arts in School Administration from Gardner-Webb University. He brings over 33 years of experience having taught, counseled, and worked with exceptional children's programs as an assistant principal and now, of course, as a principal here in North Carolina. So, Chris, we would like to welcome Mr. Rodney Smith to the podcast.
Yes, and we are honored to have him. And Mr. Smith has a wonderful fascination of things related to history. And we've enjoyed being able to talk to him off the podcast just about various historical things. And he brought to us a unique story about Daniel Boone. And I think both of us were intrigued by his knowledge of the life and also the legacy of Daniel Boone. So Rodney, we're glad to have you here with us today, and I know that our listeners are going to be excited to gain some unique insights into this story of a honest, rugged individual who really had a difficult life, but really did leave a legacy.
He sure did. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for being here. So, Rodney, if you would just take a moment and introduce us to Daniel Boone.
Okay. So what you have to really go back to is England, the country of England. Now, I know most people don't think of Daniel Boone being an English citizen, but technically he was, because his grandfather, George, at the time, sent over his kids, Squire, which was Daniel Boone's dad, George Jr., and his daughter, Sarah, and he sent them over to basically Philadelphia. Because as you know, Philadelphia was a port city. So they go into Pennsylvania, and they kind of figure out and spot land, and they start to live there at this land. It's called Ole, which means valley, and it's in Pennsylvania. So in about 1713, they're over here. They're buying the land. They're getting started. They bring over Father George from 1717, and Squire and this girl by the name of Sarah Morgan. They meet 1720. They get married. Squire's 25. Sarah's 20. And all of a sudden now they start having kids. And they have 11 kids. And out of that genealogy, if you will, Daniel was number 6. And he didn't really care for school too much, but his father was a weaver and a blacksmith. And mom was was Welsh, and she kind of raised the kids and tended to the garden and would go out in the pasture with the cows and milk them and so forth. And she would take Daniel with her a lot of times, and that's where he developed his love for the outdoors. They bought a farm, 250 acres, and Daniel and grandfather and father, they start to establish this area along with the 11 kids, and they start a meeting house. Now, what's interesting about Daniel Boone is he was a Quaker. He was part of the Society of Friends. His grandfather was, his dad was, his whole family was. And what happens is that along the time the valley, this place called Valley starts to grow, is that his grandfather becomes Justice of the Peace. So they start this Quaker area, if you will. They start this meeting house, and it starts to grow. And along this time, there's things happening. Daniel gets smallpox at an early age. He survives it. He gets smallpox because he doesn't want to be indoors. He's always loved the great outdoors. That's where he develops his love again for the hunting and the trapping and all that. So he has this thing about the wilderness. He loves it. His thoughts were on hunting and not school. His father made the comment many times that we'll let the girls do the spelling and leave the hunting and trapping to Daniel. So as he gets older, he starts to want to wander away. And his brother Samuel marries this woman by the name of Sarah, and she actually becomes the teacher for Daniel Boone. She teaches him to read, spell, write, do some math. It was said by the time he reached manhood that he had a normal education or literacy equal to the men of most time. At this time, Pennsylvania's growing. It's becoming a melting pot. You have the Swedes, you have the Dutch, and you have the English settling in this area. And as I said, they were growing, and they were pushing the Indians out of the land. They tried to live peacefully with the Indians, or the Indians tried to live peacefully with the Swedes and the Dutch, but it wasn't working. But the Quakers, they had this thing about the Indians. They treated them like citizens. In fact, it's said that the Indians would come through the farm and stay with the grandfather and the father. So Daniel started to have this love not only for the outdoors, but learning things from these Indians. In fact, he learned a lot of his skills from an old Delaware Indian. At this time, you have the Indians there, Delaware, Shawnees, Mingos, Iroquois, and so forth. So about 1740, things start to change a little bit in this area. His squire's oldest daughter, Sarah, she marries a worldling. And what a worldling is, somebody that's not a Quaker. In fact, he's actually a German. His name's, I believe, Jonathan Wilcoxon. And they had this big feud among the other Quakers. And they said, well, you can't do this. You can't bring in outside people. And Squire says, you know what? This is my land. I'll kind of do what I want to. And they kind of go, and they're fine for a while. And then the brother, the oldest son, says, you know what? If it worked for my sister, I'm going to do the same thing. So he marries a worldling. And now there's an uproar in this Quaker society. So his dad's kind of a peaceful man. He says, okay, I don't want an argument, so I'm going to take the Great Wagon Road, that comes out of Pennsylvania and travels all the way from Virginia to the Carolinas to Georgia and other parts. He says, I'm going to take my family and I'm going to move on. And he takes his Great Wagon Road to North Carolina, of all places. And he settles in this place called the Forks of the Yadkin. Now, the Forks of the Yadkin is basically what they call Mocksville. It's in Davie County, Mocksville, North Carolina. It comes from the old word, Old Mox Field, and originally it denigrates to Old Mocksville or Mocksville. So that's where Daniel starts to, and he's about 20 at this time, and he loves it because there's bear there, there's deer there, there's otter there, there's muskrats there. It's like a land of plenty, if you will. And he starts to, he already knows how to trap and hunt, so he gets real successful at it. In fact, by 1751, his dad's purchased 640 acres around the Forks of the Yadkin, basically what is Mocksville, North Carolina now, and Daniel's trapping and he's hunting, and the nearest town is Salisbury. Now, Salisbury is an old colonial town. It was known for merchants, and it was known for supplies and everything, and it had a real big influence on Daniel. So he would take these when he would kill these deer, he would take the skins and turn them in and get money. That's where we get the word buck from, the dollar, because it was actually a deer skin or a buck. So it is said by 1753 that 30,000 deer skins came out of just Rowan County alone. So you have this, he's growing up, he's exploring, and he's getting older, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to go off and do some more hunting and trapping. Well, about this time, the French and Indian War break out, 1755. And the governor of Virginia at the time, I think it's Bryce Dobbs, calls for men to help the British to expel the French. Now, you got this area around North Carolina, which is basically English control, but the Tennessee, the Ohio, the Kentucky area, that's kind of French controlled, and there becomes a battle, if you will. So he hooks up with this guy by the name of General Braddock, and they're going up to Pittsburgh to Fort Duquesne to expel the French Canadians back up into Canada, because now there's a war going on. There's one going on in Europe, but it's also called the French and Indian War in America. So Daniel, you would think being a great hunter or whatever, would have joined the militia, but he actually joined the Teamsters, which is just basically a person hauling ammunition and supplies in the wagons. So Braddock has about 2,000 men. He's trying to get to Fort Duquesne to push the French back up into Canada. And along the way, he decides, I got 2,000 men. I'm just going to do 1,400. I'm going to put my wagons in the back. I'm not going to, they're holding me back. So he gets up there up in this area. And, of course, one of your favorite people, Ray, is also part of this by the name of, then I think it was like Lieutenant George Washington. And he goes up there to Fort Duquesne with Braddock, and they're trying to expel the French out. And all of a sudden, the French and the Indians come and they ambush the British regulars, if you will. And it's said that of those 1,400 men, they either wounded or killed 900. Along the way, General Braddock is mortally wounded. And this has an impact on Daniel immediately, because he's like, bullets are flying and everything. So he turns the team around and he hightails it back to Pennsylvania to be with his family. So it's about a year later, he comes back to the Forks of the Yadkin. He marries this woman by the name of Rebecca Bryan, 1756. They will have 10 kids. Some of their kids will die because of either disease, but most of them will die because of Indian raids, and the Indians kill two of his boys. Along this time, Daniel has this idea that he wants to go more trap and hunt, and he goes more toward the mountainous area. Now you got to understand the Forks of the Yadkin, which I didn't make clear, is in the Piedmont area. Okay, it's in the area where it's the foot of the mountains. So he travels to places up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he starts to hear about this place called Kentucky. Okay, he hears about this place called Kentucky, and there's this guy by the name of Richard Henderson. Now, Henderson is a very popular name in Rowan County. In fact, Henderson was a judge, okay? And there's always been speculation that Henderson got Daniel Boone to go into Kentucky to scout it out, to learn about it, to see all the land, to see what was there, because Judge Henderson was a land speculator. He had this company. At first it was called Richard Henderson Company, and then it became the Transylvania Company. So Daniel went up there for Kentucky about 2-3 years, scouted it out, whatever, did his trapping, did everything he could, and then he's discovered by the Shawnee. Okay, and to the Shawnee, this is sacred land, because nobody really owns Kentucky. The Shawnees kind of manage it, if you will. The Cherokee get permission from the Shawnee to go hunt in Kentucky, but nobody really owns it, which I found fascinating. So anyway, the Shawnee find Daniel Boone, take his stuff, and tell him to get back down. You're not part of this. We don't want you up here. We don't want you taking our animals. This is our hunting preserve, and no white man's going to come here. Now, Daniel Boone wasn't the first to visit Kentucky, but he had heard a lot about it. He had heard a lot about it from the people that were in the French and Indian War. So he thought, this is a great way to make a living. That's what he wanted to do. He was a hunter and a trapper. That's exactly what he was. That's how he made his money. Richard Henderson, again, was a judge. Daniel Boone came up on some debts because Daniel Boone didn't pay a lot of his taxes sometimes. So at this time, he goes before Judge Henderson, and Judge Henderson knows that he's been to Kentucky. He knows he's been this fur trapper. He says, you know what? I will forgive your debts on the side, but you've got to go into this place called Kentucky and let me know everything about it, because I think I want to be able to buy this land. Now, when you go back colonial times, this land of what's now Middle Tennessee and Eastern Kentucky belongs to the colony of Virginia. But Richard Henderson wants to make this the 14th colony. So he says, you know what? I want you to find a way in there. Now, the warriors, called the Great Warrior Path, they can kind of go through there. It was small enough, and they traveled. You know, they didn't have the big wagons and all these people. They would just go up there and hunt. But Richard Henderson wants to make it part of the 14th colony, so he has to get people up there. So he wants him to establish a wilderness road, if you will. And, you know, it comes the Cumberland Gap to Kentucky, which separates Tennessee from the edge of Kentucky. So Henderson finances Boone, okay? And he gives him 60 to 70 settlers to go up there and to start to settle this place in Kentucky. Now, Daniel Boone was just the guide. The guy who was really responsible for this, which I found fascinating, is a guy by the name of William Russell. William Russell was from Culpeper County, Virginia. He was gone to the College of William and Mary. He had married the widowed sister of Patrick Henry, and Boone was just a backwoodsman. He was along just to give the logistics, if you will. So you keep going through this. They settle up there in Boonesboro. Richard Henderson buys the rights, if you will, from Dragon Canoe, who is the chief, if you will, of the Eastern Band of Cherokees, and the Sycamore Souls on the banks of the Watauga River right there in Tennessee. And now he has this land. So Boone goes up there with about 50, 60 settlers, establishes this little area of Boonesboro. It's a fort. It's approximately anywhere from 180 feet long to 240 feet wide. And it's a palisade fort. And they put this in Boonesboro, and now the Shawnee are getting a little upset because now you have white settlers coming in. They've already ran Boone off. So what happens along the way is, this is the fall of 1775, they claim 1,000 acres and they call it Boonesboro. So along this time, you know, you still have the American Revolution has just started. You're having the British, who are now allied with the Shawnees and the Mingos, and they're trying to push the colonists out, especially these frontier towns, because if you remember from the French and Indian War, the British said they wouldn't go west of the Appalachians, and the frontiersmen said, well, forget that, we're going to do what we want to. And that was the beginning of the raids and everything. Daniel Boone is captured by the guy by the name of Blackfish. He is taken in. He's actually adopted by Blackfish, and he calls him, if I remember correctly, Sheltawee, which means big turtle. So you have that, and Boone, you know, he establishes Boonesboro. There's a raid on Boonesboro. The people at Boonesboro accuse Boone of being a traitor because he's real good friends with Blackfish, and that's who attacked Boonesboro. In fact, Blackfish had adopted him as a son, and you keep going on, and all of a sudden now he's back out of Boonesboro. He comes back to North Carolina, where he reconnects with his wife, Rebecca. The interesting thing about Rebecca is she stays and raises the kids, and Boone goes and does his own thing. But they have what most people consider a happy marriage. They have 10 kids. So you keep going on. So all these things happen. And the fascinating thing about Daniel Boone is, in 1781 he's elected to the Virginia Assembly. On the way, he's captured by Cornwallis. Rebecca Bryan, who is his wife, has loyalist ties. So there's speculation that Cornwallis knew this and sets him free. Boone goes on, lives in Charleston, West Virginia, moves back to Kentucky. There's a lot of things he does. And then in 1790, I think it's 7, he gets fed up with the whole area. He says they're too close, and he moves to Missouri, which is Spanish controlled. And he kind of becomes a governor of this area, and he gives out land claims and whatever. So when Napoleon sells Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson, or Thomas Jefferson buys it from Napoleon, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, all these land grants are null and void. So Daniel loses out all his money there. He goes back to Kentucky to take over his debts in 1798. His wife dies in 1813. They go live with his last son Nathan. Congress gives him a little tract in Missouri because of of all the things he's done. His grandson, 1815, is killed in ambush. So all by Indians. His son is killed. And then 1820, he basically dies. He dies in Missouri. A delegation in 1845 sent to bring back his bones to Kentucky because all of a sudden now he's kind of become famous. And the funny thing about that is they don't know if they ever got the right bones because where he was buried in the cemetery is not necessarily where they dug up. So that's just kind of a nutshell, if you will, of Daniel Boone. He's the archetype backwoodsman.
Yeah, and now, what year did he die in exactly?
He died in 1820.
And he's buried there in Kentucky, or at least they believe he's buried in Kentucky?
There was a Kentucky delegation in 1845 came and got his wife's bones. In fact, they dug up the grave and they said, the coffin was destroyed. The bottom part of the coffin actually was in great shape. But he was not buried beside her. He was buried at the foot. But what they did was they dug Rebecca up, and they dug up the body beside him. So the rumor has always been that Daniel still is buried in Missouri and his relatives are buried in Kentucky.
Okay, all right. When we think about Daniel Boone, Chris, if our listeners are like me, maybe the picture of Daniel Boone is very much a woodsman picture of this guy sort of living in the woods, roughing it type of thing. And he certainly did that kind of thing. But when we look at Daniel Boone, you see a man who was really one of the top citizens there in Kentucky. He was a businessman, a politician, a fighter. This wasn't just some backwoods yokel who you could write off.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and I appreciate Rodney's very detailed sketch of this man because I think it shows us a couple of unique things. Number one, he's not this just backwards outdoorsman. I mean, Rodney took us from his roots in Pennsylvania, but just think for a second, he went Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, and I think he even went to Florida, if I'm not mistaken,
right.
at some point. I think that's what you said.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't think of just a outdoor guy. Just, he would kind of be in his 20-mile radius maybe, right? But this guy covered more area than a lot of people who were actually settling during this period. So I think that's something to be said. Not only that, but this guy, based on what I was hearing you say, he served somehow in some capacity under 5 different flags maybe. I mean, you've got the United States, that's the first one. You've got Spain, because that was the judge tree, right? Didn't he do, like, he was the sheriff, he was the judge, he was the jury, and he did that. So he had Spain, and then France, when the Napoleon with the Louisiana Territory. You've got England serving under General Braddock in Washington, which I think is fascinating. Daniel Boone goes one direction and George Washington goes the other direction. And both of them have major insights into the development of our country. So I think our listeners and me, that was kind of something I pulled together in listening to this, how those two individuals go 2 different ways, but yet they both have an amazing part in forming our country. And then, the natives, because he actually, as you said, he is part native now. He actually, and some, if I'm not mistaken, didn't some say that he took on a native wife also? While he was in captivity,
yes.
And you said he called him son. I mean, so Ray, that's not the backward coonskin wearing guy who just goes around hunting bear.
Yeah, and the coonskin hat. Okay, that was a fallacy, a myth, if you will. Now, when you see Davy Crockett, Walt Disney version of it, Fess Parker plays Davy Crockett. Well, they thought he was so good at Davy Crockett, they were going to pay Daniel Boone. He still keeps the coonskin hat. Fess Parker was 6'5". the actor. You know, the TV series ran from like 64 to 1970. Daniel Boone, is the tallest, was 5'8". He didn't wear a coonskin hat. He wore a beaver hat. But he was just, you know, there were a lot of things, a lot of myths about Daniel Boone. He was a fascinating man as it was. But what happened was a guy by the name of, let me see if I can find it, John Filson, wrote this manuscript called The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky, to which is added the appendix continuing the adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone. That's a lot for a manuscript. But he prints 1,500 copies. And this is what I found fascinating. Of these 1,500 copies, it becomes a hit. But it becomes a hit in Europe. They consider Daniel Boone the natural man. It's this fascination with this frontier that they've never seen. They've heard about, they've read about, but Daniel Boone becomes this backwoodsman that represents the entire, if you will, Ohio Valley, United States area. So that's what I found fascinating by him.
Yeah, and I think the final thing that I would say about this is here's the story of a man who never gave up. He never quit.
Yeah.
But he was also honest. He was caring. I think maybe it was before the podcast or during the podcast that you mentioned that he engaged with the natives and he fought with them. And it was interesting that I think his Quaker roots, he didn't like killing, did he?
No.
I mean, just a very few people that he...
It's said that he killed, and this is coming from his son Nathan, because Nathan was his last son, and Daniel Boone would share these things with him. And Nathan shared these things with Lyman Draper, who I'll tell you about later. But basically, he said he killed 3 men. He killed one on his way to Pennsylvania after the ambush of Braddock because, according to him, the Indian was intoxicated. Daniel was trying to cross a bridge. The Native American pulled a knife on him. Daniel Boone flipped him over, and when he did, he fell 40 feet to his death. The other time that he killed a person was when his daughter was abducted. She and 2 of her friends were on the Ohio River right outside of Boonesboro, and the Indians were around, and Daniel told them not to go out, but they went out instead, and the Indians captured them. In fact, James Fenimore Cooper in The Last of the Mohicans kind of uses this scene in his book about the capture of this woman, this English woman. So he follows the Indians for 30, 40, 50 miles because what they're going to do is they're going to take these girls, and this is during the American Revolution, they're going to take these girls up to Detroit to get money and supplies for them. So Daniel, along with 5, 6 other men, go after them, and he actually shoots one of them. Now he thinks they don't know if he actually killed him. What's interesting is the Indian he kills is actually the son of Blackfish. And Blackfish later adopts Daniel Boone as his son. And the third time that is recorded is in the Battle of Blue Lick, 1782, where they're up in Kentucky and they're ambushed by the Indians, and his oldest son Israel is killed. And of course he retaliates and kills. But you would think of this great frontiersman, and you see all this, you would think that he would be pro-American, but he was actually more of a loyalist. He still supported the crown, and that was one of the reasons that the charge of treason was brought against him in Boonesboro.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting, I don't think it's been mentioned yet, is his brother Ned.
Yeah.
When he was in 1780, when he was in the Ohio Territory, his brother Ned is shot and killed.
Yeah.
And then he's beheaded, and the Indians that did that thought they had killed and beheaded Daniel Boone.
They did.
So that's very interesting. And he was also, in 1781, he was captured by Bannister Tarleton, who had a very violent reputation, and he managed to survive that as well. So he has a number, including his time there in the French and Indian War, with Braddock, he has a number of very close calls.
Yeah. And remember that at the age of 70-something, he loves war.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't like killing people, but he loves war because he is 70-some years of age, and he actually goes and volunteers to fight in the War of 1812. But somebody says, well, you might be just a little too old now.
Right.
You might need to back off a little bit. But I think it shows his rugged determination. Not that he was necessarily fighting, as you were just mentioning, for country per se, but based on loyalty. And but yet the country did respond to him. I think it was it Madison that actually gives him, you mentioned Congress, and Madison giving him back 850 acres.
Missouri,
in Missouri. But what happened was all the people in Kentucky found out he got all this land in Missouri, and they went after him and basically took his land, took his money, and basically took everything that he had. And I guess he dies maybe he dies a broke man, but does he die a rich man? How would you? What is the legacy of Daniel Boone? You have an extensive background on this guy. So for me, what's his legacy?
I think his legacy is one that never gave up. He constantly explored. He was not a homebody. I don't know if Rebecca knew that before she married him, but he would constantly go out and hunt and trap and explore. And he made a name for himself, but he really didn't get that name until John Filson came and interviewed him at 50 years of age. And then Lyman Draper, who started interviewing these people around the Ohio Valley area and what they call the Trans-Allegheny area, Middle Tennessee to Kentucky, in North Carolina and Virginia, started hearing about Daniel Boone. Now, Lyman Draper had over 500, I think it's volumes, of people at this time because he wanted to know the history so they could preserve it. And this guy, Daniel Boone, kept coming up, and a lot of it was like, some of it was a little mythology, some was a little bit added flavor, if you will. But for the most part, he was just a regular person who was caught up in this time of expanding of the colonies in America.
Yeah, I mean, what a fascinating gentleman. And you mentioned John Filson. His book really made Boone the celebrity.
Yeah.
He made Boone celebrity. Do you know how accurate that book is? Was it, as far as, I know it was somewhat of contemporary there, but how accurate was it?
I don't know the accuracy, but one of the things that I find fascinating was that when it was read to Boone and Boone would quote parts of it, he said, "This is the most accurate book I've ever read."
So according to Daniel Boone,
it was right on the right. Yeah, it's right on the money. It was right on the money.
According to Daniel Boone, it got the endorsement. So, Rodney, I want to thank you for coming in today and joining us on this episode of the podcast to talk about Daniel Boone. And I know a lot of information our listeners did not know. And Chris, this is history you didn't know but should. So now our listeners know. Thanks for joining us on this podcast today. If you'd like to contact us, you can contact us on Facebook, Twitter, Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcast, and you can also contact us by email at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.